I'm going to talk about an old-fashioned sort of subject, but trying to put it in our context. So you could call this tawakkul in context. The ancient texts portray a simple world for which simple solutions are revealed and legislated. Sometimes when we turn to the pages of the Seerah or to any of the classical texts of Islam, we breathe a sigh of relief, thinking that world which we can conjure up, perhaps reliably, perhaps fancifully in our mind's eye, was a world where good and evil were clearly discernible, where ambiguities were the exception rather than the rule. And nowadays we're in an age of shubha, of fitna, where the grey areas seem to have expanded and where light and dark are kind of sometimes harder to differentiate. And even in areas where we do think we know what is right and what is wrong, thanks to mass communications and also the strident voices of certain marginal groups, we're always aware that even those things are the subject of disagreement. It's a paradox of the modern condition, perhaps, that as we know more and more facts, our spiritual and metaphysical and moral certainties become fewer. The big questions that our ancestors knew or thought they knew the answers to, which they thought were very simple, nowadays we don't have clear-cut, unanswerable responses to, but we know a whole lot of stuff about the microscopic world and about the world of galaxies and radio stars that would have been unimaginable and dismissed as strange fantasies by our ancestors. And that's really the paradox of the modern condition, not being able to see the wood for the trees. More and more trees and fewer people who really think that they can defensively claim to have seen the whole picture. So that's our context. An age that says it's an age of knowledge, but is a knowledge of small things. It's short-sighted. It doesn't have a larger vision. And the purpose of revelation is not really to give us a detailed knowledge of the juz'iyat, the little things in creation, but rather to give us a ground plan so that we can see how to respond to those small things. And where we are given guidance on small things, as in the fiqh we so frequently are, we always know what that means. Everything in the life of the believer falls into a larger pattern. The way in which you cut your hair, the way in which you eat your food, the first things you say in the morning, the last things you say at night, if you are a believer seeking to follow the sunnah, are not just conventions, things that you do because in an absent-minded kind of way you've heard other people doing them, or because you feel cool and smart doing them, or because you feel different doing them, but because they are part of a larger whole. The religious life is holistic. And that's part of the beauty, the comprehensive, total shape of the Sharia. Everything in life, even those little things, sometimes apparently trivial things, are important because they indicate our awareness that everything in the human experience should be directed towards the source of the human experience, and that everything in the world of his, of what is tangible, has a due response gifted in revelation that directs us towards ma'na, or meaning. The modern world, however, despite the endless range of lifestyle options which it opens up to us, in fact not such a wide range when you consider that in fact it's a single global culture, a monoculture that is increasingly prevailing. Another of our paradoxes, more and more rights to do more and more different things, but more and more people in the world, especially young people, wanting to do essentially the same thing. That in the context of that, we have a kind of complete fragmentation, that there is no holistic vision of human activities. Everything has become atomized. It's as though the revolution in modern physics, which has swept aside Newton in favour of the idea of ultimate indeterminacy at the subatomic level, with lots and lots of particles essentially doing their own thing, often for no discernible reason, the collapse of order and a new vision of matter is based on fundamental chaos and disorder, has also infected the human condition as well. But what we do and what we experience as we go through life is simply a whole range of different choices, experiences, interesting trips and relationships with no real code that indicates how all of these things fit together. We're not only an individualistic society in that everybody wants to go his own way, and we tend to look down upon people who accept authority, but even in our own lives as we go through them, we tend to hop around from attitude to attitude, practice to practice, and there may be no general rule that indicates the connection between, for instance, what we do in our homes with what we do at work, or what we do when we're crossing the road with what we do when we're attending a funeral. Everything is kind of fragmentary and bitty, and that accounts for much of the well-known sort of malaise of the modern condition, the spread of depression and strange dieting and other disorders, forms of self-harm and self-hatred, often amongst people who, on the face of it, seem to be possessed of all the advantages of a kind that earlier generations would have found completely incomprehensible. It's the paradox of our condition, and where it's going we don't really know too well. One of the paradoxes of modernity is that whereas earlier civilizations knew what the ideal society was like because they thought it had already happened, certainly that was the case in the Muslim vision, modernity thinks that the ideal is somewhere out there in the future, and that the past is generally a realm of medieval superstitions and shadows. So the modern condition seems to be all about becoming. It's never really about being. Everything is moving towards something better. There is economic growth, growing towards, well, we're not quite sure what the objective is, and probably there isn't an objective. It's just a process. It's not moving towards some kind of utopia, even in the communist sense. It's just more and more. More and more consumption, more and more production, more and more entertainment, more and more and more. And nobody's really thinking about it, except for the people who are right at the top of the system, who do it not because they believe that it's humane, but because they're making a lot of money out of it. Or some thinkers who may be crying in the wilderness, wondering and worrying where we're going. But the typical modernist thinker is so phobic about the past, because the modernist thinker is generally in favour of gay rights, gender liberation, all kinds of other things, that person is blinded to the possibility that there might have been real human peace, serenity and human excellence in past ages. So the modern dissident, particularly the leftovers of Marxism, somebody like Terry Eagleton or Slavoj Žižek, are depressed whichever way they look. They don't like the past, but they're really worried about the future. And this is flagged up most conspicuously when we look at the issue of the environment. Earlier generations took nature for granted, whatever view they might have had of it, and Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus and others had quite different views of nature, of what nature was, the sense in which we are part of it, the sense of in which we live with it or react against it. The major differences between classical civilizations, but nature was always assumed to be a constant, usually a very powerful constant. Somewhere out there beyond the last lights of the village there was the forest or the mountain, and humanity had a due sense of his own weakness and humility. Now things are reversed, and it's as though nature is seeking refuge in a few last places. Everywhere else it has been tamed or has been annihilated or even reinvented, so that almost half of the crops being grown in today's world are genetically manipulated, so that various corporations can make money through patenting pesticides that you have to buy if you're not going to suffer some agricultural collapse. Very strange transformations which are challenges to traditional religious understandings, which generally assume that nature was this big constant, God's world, certain forces, enormous forces in the grip of which we were largely helpless, and the whole ethos of tawakkul was very frequently shaped in terms of that. What did the spiritual seeker do if he wanted tawakkul? Well, he'd go off into the deserts and deal with the lions and the vultures as best he could and cultivate his sense of reliance on Allah in that context. But where do we do that now? What is the context for that sort of radical submission to virgin nature? Seems to be hardly possible any longer. Another major redefinition that problematizes the old religious way of looking at things is, of course, the human body, an even more fundamental constant. Whatever else they might have disagreed on, classical sacred civilizations assumed that the basic location of the human self was the soul, and the soul was located, while we're on this earth, in the body. It might depart from the body in certain strange circumstances, in dreams or visions or odd spiritings of various kinds, but essentially the body and the soul were together, and death was what happened when they separated. Now, however, not only do we not really have a proper conception of a continuous and coherent human self, but we are starting to edit the body as well, cosmetic surgery being just one of the growth industries which enable people in a quite extraordinary way, in the traditional understanding, to edit themselves. Michael Jackson being really not so much an eccentric as simply somebody who's taken this modern logic to an extreme point. Similarly with genetic engineering and various other things that are increasingly pressing for legalization, we have come really, in our point in history, to the end point of Homo sapiens as traditionally understood, and could be on the brink of something very strange, very challenging, and something that in particular is going to challenge the ethics of the religions. And some will say that's because the religions are outdated. Others will say they're needed now more than ever before. And we would say that one of the blessings of the fiqh and the sunnah and the sharia is that it's very big on our, first of all, relationship to nature, because that's the fundamental Quranic explanation for God, universe, meaning, time. These are ayat. And secondly, because our fiqh so closely acknowledges the inseparability of body from soul. Every one of those little physical details in the books of fiqh is actually a spiritual instruction. It's explaining how your outward matches and mirrors and harmonizes with your inward. And this is very different from certain types of Western Christian understanding, which assume that the body is really just a kind of messy thing that you try to get away from through celibacy or extreme forms of self-denial. But the Islamic vision is the precise opposite of that. So we even have in the Aqidah the idea of the soul as being something physical that extends through the body and is coterminous with the body and has an actual physical existence. We have an idea of physical resurrection, because when we face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is our full identity as human beings that is to be judged. We are there in our fullness, such as it is, not just disembodied ghosts, but in our reality. We can't really imagine what our consciousness, what our moral decisions, what our sense of self would be if we were genuinely detached from the body, because all of our experiences are mediated by the senses and mediated by experience of having physical ownership of a certain small segment of space and time. And also, paradise and the fire are described in very physicalizing terms. Exactly what that could mean may be beyond the horizons of our imagining in dunya, in the here below. But nonetheless, the descriptions are haqiqah. They're not just majaz, they are reality. They're not just allegory or metaphor. We have been given this assurance. So the picture that we should have, I think, is that in this world which is really taking us out of ourselves, out of nature, out of biology, out of the ahsani taqweem, the most beautiful form in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam and Hawa, so that we're sucked into the computer, sucked into a virtual reality, sucked into the muzak of the shopping mall, sucked into the alternative universe of the computer game, and the body-soul difference emphasized by ancient Christianity almost turned into a reality now, the fiqh gives us a way of focusing once again. And the people who see beyond the surface, beyond the skin of our bodies, can see how important this is. That the real ibadah is that ibadah that engages the body as well as the soul. If you sit still on a chair and try and do the kind of inward transformations that you do during the salat, the prayer, it's harder than if you're actually engaging the body, because the body influences the soul and is really an aspect of the soul, just as the soul influences the body and is an aspect of the body. You can't separate the two. So the people who see this, and we know that the famous hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ watched a man coming into the mosque, and the man prayed, and prayed in an apparently acceptable way. The Prophet ﷺ asked him to repeat his prayer 3 times, and then he explained it's because the khushu', the inward submission, was not present, and with his firasa, his basira, he could see that. And very strange things are encountered by anybody who has any kind of awareness of the strange things that the human ruh, the human soul, can do. Out-of-body experiences are reported by non-Muslims as much as they are by Muslims. Recently dealt with a girl who was in a bad motor accident from a very secular, originally Muslim background. And in the hospital she was having these very frightening experiences of regularly waking up and finding that she was floating above her body and looking down on it, gradually descending into it. And often one encounters people who occasionally have that kind of experience. So I told her to do the prayer, start up the prayer again, and she found it really very helpful in that it brought together body and spirit in the proper relationship which they're supposed to have with each other. But modernity is shattering us at this very deep level, dividing us from our natural matrix, dividing us from ancestral forms of family relationship and religion, beauty, the sacred, the arrangement of the home, arrangement of marriage, relationship between young and old, children, parents. All of that is being shattered and replaced with a kind of individualism whose basic assumption is all of those old things got in the way of personal gratification. And the religious consequences, of course, have been disastrous, and sometimes the form of religion that thrives under these conditions is an aberrant one, even if it takes itself to be a genuine return to tradition. Very often, the hard-line neo-religionist, who might have been brought up in a very secular, westernized way, continues this campaign against the fitra, against the body, soul, unified subject. So it's possible something like suicide bombing is an expression of that. Who could imagine that a Muslim would use his body as a weapon? Unprecedented in our history. But so westernized and deracinated are some of our people that this is something that doesn't seem strange to them. So we're not immune by any stretch of the imagination. But we do have a way to retrieve something of our humanity, which is nothing other than what Muslims have always striven for, which is the full retrieval of the Sunnah in all of its details. Now, this is something that we can kind of figure out. Okay, it's good to live a natural lifestyle. The Sunnah is a great saintly image of human perfection inherited from times past, a wonderful, dignified alternative to just messing around and following whatever preference might be uppermost in your mind. But it's difficult. All of those rules are difficult. And that's where something else comes in that you don't find so easily in the books. And that principle is that not only do we see that everything in our lives that is shaped and uplifted and made good by the Sunnah is directed towards obedience. This is the ahsan al-taqweem. Follow the Sunnah and you are, in a way that's feasible to yourself, Adamically restored. And that has to be directed also towards the sense that this process of restoration is a process of freeing oneself and of liberation, of itlaq. And that's what modernity can't see. They see somebody who is engaged in a traditional way of spirituality, and they say, oh, poor things, they're so constrained. This is dreadful. Look at the freedoms that they have been denied. They can't do this, they can't do that. Of course, what they really want to do is to have as many options as possible, because that presumably maximizes happiness. And we can't quite figure out why the women on the streets of Cairo smile so much more than the women on the streets of London, but that must be some kind of mistake. They're repressed, and we have to give them all of the options that we have struggled for ourselves. And that's a problem. But in order to get to this state of real i'tisam, and the word we use for holding to the sunnah is i'tisam, which doesn't just mean adherence, but means having a protection. Isma in Arabic means being protected. So it's something you hold on to, but it protects you at the same time, protects you from nafs, shaitan, hawa, all of the stuff that wants you to go its own way. The way of holding and of having this protection is by recognizing that this is not a restriction. This is actually opening the door to an incredible freedom, which is an anticipation of the freedom and the lack of constraint, which is the state of the people of paradise, and the state of the people who are in the grave, whose grave is incredibly open, not the state of the people in the grave who are squeezed. And that's the point that a lot of Muslims nowadays have kind of got out of focus, that this is itlaq yolo, the way of liberation. The nafs, the shaitan, the hawa, the fir'aun in the soul want us to line up and obey. The nafs is a hard taskmaster because you can never satisfy it. You get this box of chocolates, and then you get this experience, and then you see that film, and then you get that woman, and then you wear this thing, and you go on that holiday. There's another one. And the actual real moment of undiluted pleasure and satisfaction, if you ever trouble to think about it, is actually a really small thing. Why? Because the nafs, having got you, then says, but what about the next thing that you haven't got? And the more you get, the more hungry you are, like a traditional image, it's drinking the sea. The more of dunya that you get, the more you want, the thirstier you get, and you are trapped. You're caught in that. The way of the sunnah is to step outside that, to say, I don't care about those lifestyle options and the nafs that wants me to do this or to do that or to have this relationship, whatever it might be. The sunnah doesn't restrict you in a kind of absolute straitjacket, but it certainly gives you boundaries. Hudud, Allah's boundaries. And they're there in order to protect you from the wild stuff that's on the other side. And if you don't care about the boundaries, then you don't quite know in what state, psychological, spiritual, moral, religious, you might end up in. Allah might be merciful, might save you from the wild beasts on the other side of the fence, but if you climb over the fence because you think it's cool to follow what you want to do, then if you get hurt, you get hurt. So that essentially is a circumstance that we have forgotten the fundamental fact that religion is a way of being free from all of this stuff that's always grabbing at us. And that the more we give way to those things, the better they are at grabbing at us. And the more we say no, the weaker they get. It's a form of discipline. Like doing physical exercises. The weights are hard to start off. The marathon is a pain the first time. You do it again and again, and it becomes easier, and you get a kind of new experience that is rewarding. Similarly with spiritual discipline, with riyada. First time you get up for an extra prayer, it's really hard. And you wonder, well, I'm feeling so pleased with myself, maybe I'd get more reward if I'd just stayed asleep. Next night, that tends to diminish, and maybe something else starts to kick in, and it becomes easier. It never becomes easy because it's still riyada, and the reward comes from going against the nafs. The nafs never goes away, according to most of the ulama. This passion is always there because part of the jibilla, part of human nature. It's part, ultimately, of our physiology and certain instincts within us that have a physiological basis, that instinctually crave certain things. But the human will, the nafs, the ruh, can overcome them and produce this state of sakina, or calm, which is the way of the traditional Muslim. Relaxed and calm, partly because he is in a state of tawakkul and trust that Allah will sort things out, and partly also because he's not constantly being distracted and pulled at by all of these little things. Play this game, talk to that person, buy this mobile phone, all of this chatter, what the Chinese call monkey thoughts, the nafs jumping about in the head, constantly disturbing our equilibrium, wanting us to grab more things. They're calm. So that's a realization that we've unfortunately lost sight of, and sometimes religion tends to be just an alternative way of being agitated. So that instead of being agitated about the mobile phone or whatever it might be, we get agitated about some sort of political expression or the state of our communities or something else that may well be important, but really shouldn't agitate us in that way. Because deep down we should have the state of sakina, tafwid, tawakkul, taslim, which is rida, which are the qualities of the true believer who believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is really in control. So this process of i'tisam, of simultaneously holding on to the prophetic way and receiving isma, protection, through following the prophetic way, and intuiting, although usually we don't know what's out there, except for those people who've actually been out there and come back again, who often become really strong Muslims because they know the blessing of the sunnah and the protection that it confers. That process of holding on is not so easy, because there's a lot of it. And it helps to understand what it's for, and it helps to have a sense of the beauty of it and the dignity of it, which means that it helps to understand what a real human being can be in his or her tremendous dignity as Allah's Khalifa on earth, rather than just as consumer or clever mammal. But that process is only made easy when there's another dimension, which is the dimension of mahabba, of love. And Imam al-Ghazali says this is the highest of the degrees. There are degrees that lead to it, and there are degrees that lead on from it. But this is the mahabba that's indicated in the hadith and nawafil that suggests, that states that our spiritual development is mobilized by Allah's love, first of all, of the things that we do. We may be just going through the motions of the prayer, but the form is still beautiful and Allah loves that. And then we move up until Allah loves us. And then these extraordinary things happen, specified in the hadith. That's the energy of our ibadah. And that's the degree of somebody who sees Allah's signs in creation and is in awe of them and is grateful for them and loves their creator. And the one who sees that everything he has, however much he may complain about not having more, is pure gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and actually we have a lot. What billionaire in the world would not give away all his riches in order to be 20 years younger, for instance? We have blessings that we never think about. That also brings us into something of the state of love, appreciation for the divine beauty, the divine perfection, the divine gift. And then the higher degree is where you see the forms of religion and the sunnah as something beautiful and lovable. And if you really want to taste the essence of Islam, attend a classical class on fiqh. Because there you will see a banquet where human beings in various states of transformation will be experiencing in a kind of delectation the beauty of the prophetic perfection. A fiqh class ultimately comes from the majesty of the seerah, from the majesty of ahsani taqweem, best of all forms, from the majesty of a human being who is humanly perfect, the most extraordinary thing on earth. Other entities, when they're perfect, are extraordinary. A human being, when a human being is perfect, is out of the ordinary, extraordinary, and a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A very strong sign. And the process of fiqh teaching is the process of transmitting from the author of the text the love of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's what makes the fiqh easy. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beauty. He is truth. He is rightness. He is perfection. He is calm. He is unity. He is the absolute. And the perfected human being is the mirror of that, albeit finite, created, but nonetheless a genuine pointer to that, because he is khalaqa Adama ala surati. Allah created Adam in his image. Millions of pages of commentary there, but the hadith is there, in his image. And when you look at the fiqh, you see this is how possibly I could achieve something of that perfection and get out of the sort of slob-like, messy existence which I now lead, in order to be something Adamic, cosmic. And that's the excitement of the fiqh class, from the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim onwards. And that, of course, because love is something that comes about when we see perfection, and we see beauty, and we see what is admirable. Love is the central emotion of studying fiqh, and those who have studied classical fiqh and a classical text with a classical teacher, without any modernized rubbish, they always know that there is this particular sweetness to the class. And that's what makes the religion come easily. And that's why he says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that religion is easy, ad-din yusr. It doesn't mean, as some people now say, it always means take the easier option. It means religion, when properly practiced, is easier than anything else. Because it means being yourself, being fully human, being as human beings were meant to be. The lion in the circus is trained to do all kinds of tricks and sort of may put up with it. But what the lion really wants to be doing is being a lion on the savannas in Africa. Non-religious cultures treat us in the same way. We do all kinds of clever tricks, but it's not our nature. What we really want to do is to roar on the plains of Africa and be ourselves. Be real men, be real women, be worshippers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And modernity doesn't really any longer know even what that might be. And when we say, well, we'd like to be different, they say, but that'll get in the way of your performing all of these tricks. And you might even get judgmental about other people performing these tricks. And the circus has to go on. So, what we're coming to see is that religion is fitra, Islam is din al-fitra, it's the Abrahamic ancient human normality. Modernity is perversity. It's an aberration. It's the complete misunderstanding of what human beings are meant to be. But this sense of mahabba is central. Mahabba, love for that which is perfect, that which is right, that which is beautiful, that which is correct. And something that you don't choose to have. You never choose to love something, or to love somebody, or love a time or a place. It happens. So, for instance, 5 daily prayers. And I've been emailing somebody who's having difficulties with that. He's a new Muslim. And 5 daily prayers, if you're used to an individualistic Western lifestyle, is a serious undertaking. But look at it this way. If the most beautiful woman in the world came up to you and said, I'll marry you, but there's just one string attached. You have to kiss me 5 times a day. That's the deal. How many men in the world will say, well, that's kind of difficult, and move on? Not so many. The reality of the abid with his Lord, of the worshipper with his Lord, is more intense and more loving than that could ever possibly be. Not just because he knows that Allah is the source of all beauty, the source of all rightness and appropriateness, and it's with him that we were created to be. But in addition, he can give you what the most beautiful woman in the world can't give you, which is Jannat al-Na'im, the garden of absolute felicity. That's an entity deserving to be served in love and adoration 100 times a day, 500 times a day. And of course, the point of the Sunnah is that we do try and do that. Every little thing that we do, we try and do in a way that reflects this principle of ibadah. But 5 daily prayers, motivated by this ishq, this love. قم قم يا حبيبي كم تنام النوم على العاشق حرام. Get up, my beloved, how long you are sleeping. Don't you know that lovers are forbidden to sleep? But that, as I say, is not something you can kind of impose upon yourself. You don't really learn it in a book. Fiqh al-Mahabba, not really. Teach me how to love, not so easy. Where is it in the Encyclopedia of Islam, or on the internet, or in the supermarket, or in the Islamic bookshop? Not so easy. You can learn the forms, but learning the content is harder. You can transform yourself outwardly. Inwardly, that's really tricky. And historically, Muslims have usually recognized that you need a real expert to reach inside your chest and to kind of shake you up a bit and get rid of all of that rubbish. But nonetheless, the good news is that the fitrah is there, and the fitrah of human beings is to love perfection and to love beauty and to love calm, to love rightness, to love justice. It's our nature to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whenever we see anything in the world that we love it in reality because it's some reflection of the perfection of the divine. We may not even know that. Why do we love the judge at the Old Bailey who delivers justice? Well, as believers we know it's because justice is something that can't be explained in terms of the stuff of the world. It comes from beyond. It comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's one of his qualities. It's the basis of the creation of the heavens and the earth. Bil qist, with justice. And similarly with everything else. Why is it that we love symmetry, that we love calm, that we love life, that we love growing things, things that defy the entropic logic of matter and grow in springtime, flowers, leaves, young creatures everywhere? Why is it we love this? That's because it's also a sign of the nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his benign bringing out of order and beauty out of the dark chaos of lifeless matter. Why is it that we love virtue and kindness? Why is it that we love wise and patient old people? Why is it that we love faithfulness and beauty in a spouse? Why is it that we love the beauty of children? All of these things. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us so many ways of loving in this dunya. Well, it's because Allah is the author of everything in its perfect form, in its right taqweem. Where something is perverted by human misunderstanding, or where something is not really supposed to be seen by human beings anyway, normally, then there may be an experience of ugliness. You look through the microscope at a flea and it doesn't look so nice. It's not really designed to be seen by normative humanity. The basis of matter is actually scary. The basis of the cosmos is extremes of light and darkness, heat and cold, stuff crashing, vacuums. It's tough, it's rigorous, it has a certain beauty, but it's a beauty of the jalal, of majesty. But what the biosphere in which human beings are designed to exist, this potential garden of the world, the place where the descendants of Adam and Eve are supposed to work out their salvation, is a place where everything, where it hasn't been polluted by the pharaonic within us, is beautiful. So many opportunities to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in so many things. And yet, somehow we always end up noticing the ugly stuff, complaining about the ugly stuff. We might be in a meeting where people are good with each other. What we choose to remember is one little argument that happened between two people. It's because of this sickness within us, this lack of gratitude. Now, that's the context. And the rule for the believer who tries to hold on to this extremely exalted image of what human beings meant to be, in the middle of the perfect misunderstanding of modernity and its increasing craziness, dangerous craziness, hawa, desire leading to potential catastrophes for the basic order of nature on the planet, demand disasters, as they call them. So many people guzzling gas that we have a food crisis because we're turning so much corn into ethanol. Very fundamental things going wrong as a result of demand, more and more nafs, more and more desire. When we have this image of a prophetic alternative, of somebody who might not have anything but within is ghani, is independent and is free, who has this real freedom from attachment to the world. The quality of the state of mind of such a person is reliance. And this is why we may suspect this principle is a particular quality of the Ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We know that it's a prophetic virtue, and the way in which the Qur'an tells the prophetic stories does tend to emphasize this principle of tawakkul and of trust. Look at the story of Sayyidina Ibrahim and his son. What does the son say? Ya abati fa'al ma tu'mar satajiduni insha'Allahu min as-sabirin. Oh, my father, he's been told he's going to have his throat slit. Do what you have been told. You will find me insha'Allah amongst the sabirin. Quite unlike the account in Genesis where Abraham kind of tricks his son and doesn't tell him what's going to happen. The father have this extraordinary moment of tawakkul, and that leads on to an amazing future. Similarly, Sayyidina Musa told to do such amazing things, strange things. Throw down your staff, put your hand in your pocket, hit the sea, hit the rock. Amazing things. Go to Pharaoh and start preaching to him. His tawakkul is absolute. All of the Anbiya, alayhim salam, in the Qur'an are people of tawakkul, and this is the slant that Islam has put upon their stories. And of course, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, really the Imam of the mutawakkilin, because of the sheer unlikeliness of success at the outset, and really throughout the story of the seerah, the odds against him being so great, and yet trusting in his Lord. One man with his sahib, with his companion, in the little cave on Jabal Thawr, with the armies of Mecca out searching for him, and the whole future of monotheism really, depending on whether they find him or not. La tahsan, inna Allah ma'ana. He says to him, don't be sad, Allah is with us. And you might think, well, you could be sad and still have tawakkul. But he's not even being sad, because he knows that there's this ma'iyya, this withness, that he is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So relax, this quality of sakina. Even in those extreme moments of vulnerability and the unlikeliness of success, with no friend within hundreds of miles, la tahzan, inna Allah ma'ana. And again in his book we find inna Allah yuhibbul mutawakkilin, things like that. Wa 'ala Allahi fatawakkalu in kuntum mu'minin. And have tawakkul in Allah if you are really believers. Wa man yatawakkal 'ala Allahi fahuwa hasbuh. Whoever has tawakkul in Allah, he will be enough for him. Again and again. And other verses that may not mention the principle, but still are about it. One of the Imams was asked to define tawakkul, and he said, with the verse of the Qur'an, وَلِلَّهِ خَزَائِنُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَلَكِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ. Allah's are the storehouses of the heavens and the earth, but the munafiqeen don't understand. Tawakkul, fundamental principle of the Qur'an. And that's what's required in our age of precariousness, of vulnerability, of international insecurity, the invention of new stuff that's extraordinarily threatening, deep transformations in relationships between people, families, individuals, the young, the old, man, woman, nations, religions, everything being renegotiated in a very strange and threatening way. What are we told to do? We're told to have tawakkul. And that's going to be the test of whether we are truly inhabiting the sunnah. Is it something that is merely in our bodies and on our bodies but not within? So that we can form, mashallah, to every last detail of the fiqh, but inside our hearts are panicking. Never mind the stillness of the la tahzan. Inna Allaha ma'ana. Don't be afraid, Allah is with us. Not having that, but really being ready to explode like hell itself. تَكَادُ تَمَيَّزُ مِنَ الْغَيْظِ. It's an infernal quality. Hell almost explodes with rage. Sometimes I'm asked by journalists, what does the Quran say about suicide bombing? I used to say, I don't think there's anything that's at all relevant. But now I say, there is a verse, and they get kind of excited. And I say, it's in Surah Al-Mulk, and it says, hell almost detonates with rage. And that's the nearest I can find to anything like that phenomenon, that infernal quality of having so much hiqt and frustration and lack of tawakkul within oneself that you get a detonation. That's the infernal quality. The quality of tawakkul is that you're not afraid and you're in a garden already. In paradise, you can't have any alternative to tawakkul, because the divine agency, the divine presence is immediately there. Ra'yal ayn, you can't get away from reality in paradise. Never again. Don't want to, don't think about it. So tawakkul is really the nature of paradise itself. And when we are mutawakkilun, and therefore the people Allah loves, as the Quran says, we are kind of inhabiting an anticipation of that. In the fiery inferno of the world, with all of its stuff and its arguments, we inhabit a little mobile garden, which is to do with remembrance, which is to do with trust, which is to do with hope, which is to do with always being able to see the beauty, because the believer always wants to see the beauty, because the believer knows what the beauty means. Unlike the unbeliever, who may well be attracted to the ugly stuff, as you can see in art, for instance. Modern art, certainly not a celebration of beauty. The word hardly applies. Turn of Prize is all about challenging our preconceptions at best. That's the nearest they can get to it. But beauty, symmetry, truth are not criteria for the judges. So if we have this reliance and this trust, we will be inhabiting a kind of mobile garden, and we will be, inshallah, experiencing this stillness and this sanity which we crave. But it's not so easy, because Allah has set up this creation according to an absolutely precise balance. It's possible to see it as Allah's direct agency doing everything. And when you think about it, that's the only really logical way of seeing it. He doesn't kind of let go of certain things and let them happen by themselves. As Khaliq, as creator, he is Khaliqu kulli shay. He is creator of all things. Wallahu khalaqakum, he created you, wama ta'malun, and what you do. He doesn't kind of wind up the system at the beginning and then watch and occasionally intervene. He is creating everything at every single microsecond of its existence. And that's a very coherent way of seeing reality. And you can also look at reality, also coherently, in terms of cause and effect and the system being genuinely autonomous of any outside agent. And the average scientist will proceed on that assumption. The really smart scientist will probably suspect that actually that's not a sufficient explanation, that there needs to be something external to the whole system. That's a big controversy. And because the God thesis is really unfashionable and not cool amongst a lot of scientists and cosmologists, those who think that way tend to keep quiet, but more and more recognizing that it's a pretty coherent explanation. But the point is, Allah has given us the ability to see His direct action in everything, but He's also given us the ability not to notice it at all. That everything is a sign of Him, and nothing but a sign of Him, but nonetheless everything is very good at veiling Him. And that's why when we speak of coming to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in loving obedience to Him, we sometimes speak of the veil. What's the veil? Over the face of the beloved, it's dunya, it's this thing, it's stuff, space and time, this extremely improbable matrix of entities. And what we really want is to see reality. Deep down, we'd really like to see things directly rather than working things out inferentially. So we want the veil to be lifted, but at the same time we love the veil. Why? Because the veil is of the beloved. And the Muslim way is not to turn one's back on the world, except in its worldliness, but to love it because it's nothing other than the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not something that's gone wrong, that needs to be saved, redeemed, put right. It's just fine. Because we're so limited, we may not see exactly how it's fine a lot of the time. But the point of tawakkul is that you know, because you have tawheed, that actually it is fine, that it's just fine. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creating everything, and who are we to object to the way He does things? So often we can't see that, and we rebel, and we reject. Maulana Rumi tells the story of chickpeas that are being boiled up in a pot by a housewife. And the chickpeas don't have any kind of tawakkul and think that this is outrageous. And they're reciting ecstatic Persian poetry to the housewife, complaining, "What are you doing? You're torturing us. Let us out." And all she does is to push them back in. And they say, "You're a monster." But what they don't know, what they can't know, is that there is a purpose for the whole process, which is that they might be cooked, softened, sweet, useful, nutritious, beneficial. The state of the modern world is that everybody is kind of being tormented, and the world is full of suffering, different sorts of suffering now, but suffering as it always was, confusion, relationships not working, whatever. And we're all crying out, but we don't understand anything about what our condition is. There's no idea of purgation. And so we just shout and yell. But we're required to have tawakkul, to trust. And when we think about the divine-human relation, we need to recognize that a lot of stuff we will not understand. Why is history operating in a particular way? It might not be clear to human beings for 1,000 years. It might not ever be clear. Allah does what He wants. He doesn't guarantee that you'll be able to work everything out. That's not part of the deal. You are required to try and understand, and ours is a religion of understanding, of noticing what's happening in the world, a religion of intelligence, and that aql is there for a reason. But don't assume that your mind can encompass the purposes of the divine. You're not really required to do that. You are required to understand your own situation and your own wajibat, your responsibilities. And everything else is in good hands. So what we find is that we have at the heart of all this an interesting paradox. We have, on the one hand, the sunnah, which is very much about doing things, changing ourselves, changing the world, changing relationships on every level. A sunnah that seeks to sanctify everything from the way you deal with your babies to the running of a government. And at the same time also an assurance that everything is kind of all right already anyway. And that's obviously a big paradox. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is khaliqul kulli shay, and creating everything, then what on earth is sunnah and everything else for? Part of the answer to that is veiled from us. But the ulama say that, looking at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at-tawakkulu halu was-sunnatu amalu. That his inner state was tawakkul, absolute reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hence his calm, sakina. But acting was his sunnah. And to the extent that we act, conforming ourselves to this image, the nafs is overcome, and we start to adorn ourselves with these virtues, including mahabba and including tawakkul, and then that becomes our internal state. So this is really the paradoxical heart of the religious life, and something that's characteristically Islamic. La ilaha illallah means, when it's taken to its final conclusion, Allah alone is active in creation. Every last microscopic particle is moving and has the states that it has, because in that instant Allah has decreed that. There's nothing that he's not paying attention to. But at the same time, there is this majestic interventionist pattern of life, which is the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And here, obviously, we get into the deep mystery of tawheed wa tawakkul, which is there in the shahada itself. So deeply embedded in the nature of the religion is this tension that it's the basic statement of what Islam is. La ilaha illallah, like he alone is the reality. Muhammadur Rasulullah, Muhammad is the messenger of that reality. And the believer keeps those in balance. Inwardly, La ilaha illallah, which brings us calm. When you say La ilaha illallah, take a deep breath and you know that things are fine. Muhammadur Rasulullah, the prophetic summons to act in a way which is conformable with the perfect divine disposition of creation. And the exact nature of that, which is the sirr al-qadar, the secret of Allah's decree, is something that is veiled. Necessarily because we see just a tiny proportion of the whole. We can't see the whole picture. What is required of us is the amr, the divine commandment, which is to act and to conform ourselves, and then the inner state will come. To the extent that we have the fiqh outwardly, the inward will be purified. If we have this tawakkul and mahabba, it's a big if, sometimes we don't get that. When we have the inward state, then we start to see the mysteries of Allah's decree. But it can't really be communicated in a way that does it justice. Because Allah's qadar is to do with his eternity, his infinity. Human language collapses when you try to explain it. Imam al-Ghazali says, in the Kitab al-Tawheed wa Tawakkul, وَأَمَّا السِّرُّ الْقَدَرُ فَهُوَ الَّذِي تَحَيَّرَ فِيهِ الْأَكْثَرُونَ وَمُنِعَ مِنْ إِفْشَاءِ سِرِّهِ الْمُكَاشَفُونَ. As for the secret of destiny, it is the thing that baffles most people, and the people who have had things revealed to them have been forbidden to disclose it. It's not that it's a paradox that can't be resolved. There is an explanation that is to do with La ilaha illallah itself, but it can't be explained in a way that would reliably help people to understand. There are certain things that people can misunderstand. And therefore our responsibility is to say, Natawakkal Allah, we depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our path to that beautiful, blessed, calm, inward state is the Muslim path, which is the path of fiqh, of sunnah, and of conforming our outward forms to the way of the chosen one, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, knowing that that has a strong effect on our inward life. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make the ummah once again an ummah of mahabba and of tawakkul, two qualities that the world does not sufficiently see in us, and so that we may move from the state of simple outward adherence to an inward illumination by the light of the Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so that we may truly follow the Sunnah in ma'na as well as in hiss, in meaning and in concept as well as in outward form. Because this is the best ummah that has been brought forth for humanity, and we are shuhada ala nas, we are witnesses for people. We are the last people left who have a perfect blueprint for being human, which we have in the Sunnah, properly understood, and that's what everybody is crying out for. Not just drug addicts and people selling the big issue in the streets and people who are in extreme situations, but people who also are working away happily with their word processors or flying planes, but know that really there must be more to things than this, and deep down, profoundly in a state of unease and dissatisfaction. We actually have a blueprint, a solution, medicine that can help them out. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us practice what we preach, that we are shuhada'a ala nas, witnesses for mankind, because it's only through the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that things in this dark, dangerous, threatening, confusing age can ever come right, because we're the last ummah as well as the best ummah. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum. Maybe a couple of questions. I have to rush off shortly, unfortunately. As long as they're not
see beauty in everything. So in our mental and spiritual disposition towards modernity as a peculiar period in human history, don't we have a duty to see beauty in that too? And more than that, do we have, don't we risk in looking just at the fragmentation and individualism and all these aspects of modernity, of failing to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the good things in modernity?
Yeah, I mean, there are good things, and one hears the Shaykh's appreciative of modern medicine, other obvious things. But unfortunately what's happening is that the superficial things are being made more comfortable for us, but the deep things are being made more distressing and uncomfortable. What human beings really need is not it's not more cars and better healthcare, really, because people in very poor countries very often will be more cheerful than people who have all of those things, but some kind of deep inner remedy. The survey that came out last week that indicates that British people are less happy than they were 40 years ago is illustrative of that. We're twice as rich as we were, the hospitals are so much better, but we're worse off for it, damaging the environment much more than we do. So yeah, there are things to be thankful for in modernity, but it's a trade-off between quality and quantity. We get more stuff, we're more comfortable, but there's something qualitative that's been lost. And sometimes that can be really catastrophic. So there are certain things that we can't even think about or talk to. But people are so far from an idea of appropriateness and beauty that they think that homosexuality is just fine, for instance. And they think it's fine, and you think about it, and it's hard to relate to it because they're so far from any kind of fitri understanding of what's right and what's dignified. That's a real problem. In cases like that, I think Muslims shouldn't even enter the debate because it's like talking to a different species.
Yeah. Shaykh, how can we, in a sense, act with any sort of yaqeen that what we're doing is right? If we know that all is going according to a certain divine plan. I mean, if you know the first fitna in Islam, I mean, both Imam Ali would ask, our opponents in the fire, and he goes, no, they are our brothers, but they turned against us. I mean, there's often going to be a difference in opinion in how to act and engage with it. Is there any way of knowing that what we're doing is...
Well, the first hadith is إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are by intentions. We will be judged, thankfully, not for the things that we do, but firstly because of Allah's mercy, and also because even if we do bad stuff, if we have some iman, there will be some semblance of a good intention. But very often there's ikhtilaf, and it's hard to see in some cases how both can be correct interpretations. The history of the Ummah is full of that. But that's, again, a kind of surface thing. People are kind of taken aback by that. But what really is the place of judgment is not so much Muslims in the early generation fighting against each other, but intention and the quality of their souls. There were people for whom rightness was such an absolute non-negotiable thing that they fought amongst themselves. On a superficial level, that looks like a disaster. On a spiritual level, it may look something quite different, although we can't quite see that.
So in a sense, the new way of looking at if you look at the crisis as a bad thing,
Yeah, one looks at it as a bad thing, but it's nothing like the catastrophes that happen today. And the total casualties are quite small compared to modern conflicts. Unfortunately, we have a way of reading early Islamic history in terms of the maghazi, of battles. But if you look at them, they're really small things compared to what we usually think of as battles, like Ghazwat al-Ahzab. Every Muslim child knows there was a battle of Ahzab, and it was when they built the trench and the Quraysh couldn't get over the trench. It's one of the most famous battles in history. If you look at the Seerah books and you see how many people died at the Battle of Ahzab, the Muslims and the Mushrikun together, it was 14 people died. Just 14. And similarly with the other incidents in early Islamic history, they're very small things compared to what happened subsequently. So we tend to be excessively scandalized by the fitness of the early community, I think, partly because the early chroniclers and the historians tended to write in terms of outward events and conflicts. And it was harder for them to record inward spiritual excellence. That's why it's important when you read Seerah also to read Shama'il, which sometimes we forget to do. And historically, Muslims would read Seerah, but they'd read Shama'il much more often. The inward qualities, the perfections of the Prophet ﷺ. If you read Seerah, it's basically a specialized hadith genre that focuses on political events. And Orientalists, when they come to write about the foundation of Islam, they just look at Seerah books and they say, well, it's just a political story. They hardly ever look at things like Shama'il. Sometimes we tend to be similar, especially the kind of Muslims who say Islam is ideology. It isn't really, it's much bigger than that. Any of the ladies? Yeah.
I was just wondering, like you said about the bad aspects of modernity or the society of living. Obviously, like by living in the system, we are contributing to the perpetuation of it and all the bad things about it. So, are we given guidance, like presumably, like it would be preferable through our careers or our involvement in the system to try and change it or influence it to become different or something. And so we have this guidance of how to act personally, but is the guidance as well of how to act when we are in a system which is so contrary to
it's something that's covered in Revelation. You have Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, who works as an employee of Fir'aun. And the emblem of wickedness in the Quran, a pharaoh, has a prophet actually working in his administration. And very often Muslims who have been minorities in non-Muslim cultures have stressed very much the quality of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, who in an uncompromising way, and if he had to go to prison, he had to go to prison, but nonetheless he would work within that society in order to try and convey tawheed and to bring justice and truth. That's a very high prophetic degree. It's much easier to be a Muslim in a Muslim majority country. It's much harder to be to be on the front line, as it were, in this kind of culture. Some people may find it too hard and become too influenced by what's around them, and maybe it's best for them not to live here. very often I think Muslims should go and live in a Muslim country because there's just too much hassle, too much fitna. Everything is kind of edgy here. But there are also some people who can genuinely help people, and everybody has a chink in his armour somewhere where Islam can penetrate. And sometimes by working with people in the workplace and meeting with people socially, you can give them the opportunity of accepting Islam in a way that perhaps nobody else could find for them. So it depends on the individual. But what is important is to recognise that this is not just another difficult period of history, but this is an age which is historically very weird. And one aspect of that, I think, has to be that we need to be more forgiving than we used to be, because people are as weak as they've always been, more so. And yet, in some ways, Muslim communities tend to be more judgmental than they used to be. And we really have a go at people when they can't manage it, when they fail, when they make a mess of things. People are carrying a lot, and the circumstances in the modern world are very abrasive and hostile to religion. We need to be more modest in our expectations of other people, I think. Many of the problems with Muslim communities in the West is a kind of utopian perfectionism, which is not realistic and not really Islamic. If somebody comes to the mosque and we see them once a month, we might get really angry and go and give them a lecture. But the correct response is probably to say, alhamdulillah, of all of those people who've never been to the mosque, here's somebody who's actually coming, and make friends with them and bring them into the community. That would seem to be more reasonable. But unfortunately, we seem to think that the intense unpleasantness of modernity should have as its appropriate religious response a kind of unprecedented narrow-mindedness. I don't think that's right. That's an emotional reaction. It's not a fiqh, Sharia reaction. Well, in that every previous age knew what the world was and attributed it to the divine realm. Now we are invited to believe that the world is just something that exists, whose origins are not clear, whose final point is not clear, that good and evil are not rooted in heavenly principles but are just human conventions, that prayer, worship, self-denial are meaningless, and that human fulfillment comes about through getting as much stuff and as many experiences as possible. So in many fundamental ways, this is the exact inversion of what all traditional societies were. That's pretty weird. There's never been a culture quite like this. Well, that's a good point. Ancient Rome was kind of an anticipation of modernity, in that ancient Rome didn't really have a kind of point to it. It just existed to perpetuate itself. But just about every other pre-modern civilization was about heaven and transformation, art, beauty, truth. Ancient Romans were quite utilitarian, sort of anticipation. Maybe that's why Washington DC was built to look like ancient Rome. The 18th century American reaction against Christianity was very much a part of the Enlightenment determination to retrieve the values and the style of the ancient world. All of this obelisks and strange columns is deliberately non-Christian. Okay, I better one more question.
A peculiar characteristic of past 400 years has been the characteristic way of epistemic engagement that the age has had with the world in general. That is, that anything which is even the least of web has to be shunned, and this paradigm has been very successful as in the science. Now, if modernity is to be replaced by something else, a new and a better or more human epistemic paradigm has to be brought forth. And how would that conceivably be?
Well, we have to. Some Muslims think it means taking over at a higher political level and reshaping society by a kind of diktat from above. Where that's been attempted, it generally hasn't worked the way it was meant to. more classical way would be to make sure that we ourselves are inwardly and outwardly actually Muslim, so that we represent what we want other people to come to. In ourselves, and then in our families, neighbourhoods, communities, and the thing spreads from base communities. Because one advantage of the sort of extreme nature of modernity from a Muslim perspective is that people are more desperate for an alternative than they used to be. There are so many people who have jailhouse conversions who come to Islam from sort of extreme situations, whether it be German Jackson or Muhammad Ali, or people who are kind of in the limelight and then realise the hollowness of it all and come into Islam in a way that earlier generations wouldn't have been the case. That da'wah is in a strange kind of way a lot easier than it used to be. To call people who are in a state of existential confusion and anxiety is a lot easier than calling people who are absolutely embedded in traditional Judaic or Christian or Hindu style of life. So that has to be the way in which we try and replace the current reality with something better. First of all, make sure that we're actually living it ourselves and in our communities. And secondly, by reaching out to bring other people into it. But a large structural revolutionary type approach is, I think, not going to work, because the Sira model and the Islamic understanding of government generally is that the population has to be substantively in agreement with the vision of the people who are at the top. Otherwise there'll be some discontinuity and some spiritual disaster.
But even such things are not going to replace the intellectual framework which is called modernism or the postmodernism.
No, that's true, and that's why we need to engage with that as well. But religion, in a sense, is kind of not just a set of propositions, but it's a style of life and a way of being that is an argument, even though it's not a set of propositions. The saint doesn't have to say anything in order to convince people. There are cases of Islam spreading in its history at the hands of people who didn't know local languages just because of what they were. They were themselves Hujjatul Islam, a proof of Islam, something that bypasses reason, rationality. Not that it's irrational, but it's a different kind of knowledge, different kind of experience, like the experience of beauty or love or some emotional states, but something that's more powerful because it's from the human status as Allah's Khalifa. So I'm not saying that we should discard rationality or not engage with it, but that's not the level on which ultimately religion operates. The Quran is not an exercise in Aristotelian logic. It's a great lyrical evocation of the deep nature of human beings. And that's really what religion has to be.